Hello, this is Mike Hill, and you're watching my second video, which will be about the second half of the title. So about building a narrative of Weimar Germany. And we'll use some of this theory from the first video in order to look at some practical examples. Now, the first question is, why did I choose Weimar Germany as the example for this video? And there are three broad reasons. The first one is that Weimar Germany is a very common GCSE exam topic that students study in England. And I wanted to return to this idea of using content that is given to us as teachers and try and do something with it, to try and turn this into a narrative using the processes of emplotment and world building. Secondly, when I first learned about the Weimar Republic, when I was about 17, I remember that I found this really frustrating and confusing as a topic. There were just so many different people involved, so many different events, and I couldn't really make sense of this in terms of the structure. And I think that narrative is a really powerful way of doing this. So in this sense, narrative is not just about making content more interesting, but also making it easier for our students. And thirdly, as you may have picked up from my accent, which becomes stronger the longer I talk in these videos, I am German, my family are German. So for me, this is kind of bound up with family history. And that has made it really important to me to try and teach this history in a way that does justice to the past and to the people of the past. In the last video, we looked at these kind of two basic or foundational approaches of constructing plot and place. And I want to start off with plot and emplotment. And emplotment, when we teach GCSE content, is really important, I think, because there's a big temptation to treat the exam specification as if it were a curriculum. And of course, an exam spec is not a curriculum, it's just a list of content. So what I have been guilty of in the past, definitely, is to just teach that as it is specified. So teach event 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there isn't really much sense of an overarching story or of a narrative. And in particular, I think this makes some of the content harder to understand than it has to be. The key example for me is the murder of Rosa Luxemburg. When I first learned about this, even if I knew what the events were, the people involved, I didn't really understand the importance of this event. And when I taught it again, when I was a teacher, I realized the same for my students. And I think, or I've come to think, that this is partly because of how that content is structured. Because often pupils are taught about Rosa Luxemburg all within one lesson. So she appears and dies within the same lesson. And I think that is, if you will allow me one more pop cultural reference, similar to if you've seen Game of Thrones, where Sean Bean's character Ned Stark is killed in the 9th episode, and that's really, really shocking to the audience because he's the main character. It's as if you were watching Game of Thrones and you only watched that one episode. Would you really have an understanding of why Ned Stark is important or why his death is shocking? Probably not. So what I now try to do is to not introduce Rosa Luxemburg in the same lesson in which she dies, but to shift this forward. So when I teach about Germany during World War I, we introduce Rosa Luxemburg there and who she is and why she's important. And then she's present throughout the story for about 3 or 4 lessons. And I almost want pupils to think she's the main character. And then suddenly 4 lessons later, she is suddenly murdered. So we kind of introduce the ideas in lesson 1, let these ideas simmer for 3 or 4 lessons, and then we can bring them to the boil in lesson 4. So we don't have to go from 0 to 100 within one lesson. And I think this is an example of how emplotment can make content easier to understand for students. Now, you might think that this is interesting, but you're not really in a position to add more content into your GCSE teaching, because we all know the exam specs are very, very crowded. There's lots in there. However, I think introducing Rosa Luxemburg in this way is a good example of what Dale Banham, in his iconic article in Teaching History 99, called Overview Through Depth. So what Banham did was that he taught his Year 7 class, I think, a really rich narrative of King John for about 8 weeks, before they then went on to study other monarchs in less detail as a kind of overview. And Banham says that depth, in this sense, makes subsequent overview more accessible, more rigorous, and more efficient. In other words, to spend 8 weeks on King John, or in our example now, 1 lesson on Rosa Luxemburg, is not an indulgence. It is a way of saving time. And it saves time because it establishes foundational understandings that make it easier for pupils to assimilate other content later on. I would like to give one more example for emplotment, which also highlights some of the potential problems with this approach and how we might get around them. Another key event in the story of Weimar Germany and in an exam specification is the 1925 presidential election when Hindenburg becomes the president. Now, when I taught this, I realized that students were often really confused about who Hindenburg is because he doesn't appear in the rest of the course until this lesson. And of course, that makes it hard for them to understand who he is and why they should care about him. It's sort of as if they've been reading a novel or watching a TV show, and they feel as if they've suddenly skipped an episode or they've skipped a chapter. And this is something I really try to avoid when I'm teaching the specified content. I want all of the transitions from lesson to lesson or the steps within the narrative to be smooth. So I then thought, what can I do with Hindenburg? What's the best way of introducing him to the story? And at first I thought I might introduce him right at the beginning, like Rosa Luxemburg, but ultimately I decided not to do this. Firstly, I think if we introduce all of the characters at once in the same lesson, that actually ends up making it more confusing for pupils. And the whole point of emplotment is to make the story less confusing, to make it clearer. Secondly, Hindenburg then only really appears much later, so halfway through the course. And I thought it was not really feasible to keep the memory of him and who he is alive in my pupils' memory for kind of 8 or 9 or even 10 lessons. So what I did instead was that I kept Hindenburg in lesson 8 in this example, but I started lesson 8 by spending about 20 minutes to recap the whole course, the whole story we'd already studied from Hindenburg's perspective. So we look at the fact he's born into an aristocratic family, he goes to military school, he then comes out of retirement to lead armies in World War I and becomes a celebrated war hero. He really is a celebrity at the time. And then after the war, he becomes one of the key players who popularized the stab in the back myth. So that helped me to recap content we'd previously studied, and I could question them about what they remembered. But it also allowed me to ease Hindenburg into the story so that by the time he becomes the president, pupils know who he is and they know how he fits within the wider story. And this is what I would call a kind of narrative flashback. So you might remember the Star Wars examples from the last video. So this is similar to kind of inserting a flashback into the narrative, which gives greater coherence to the narrative. And in the same way, maybe you recognize that the Rosa Luxemburg example was about planning for powerful reveals. We need to identify key moments in the narrative, and then we need to prepare our students for them. And emplotment, I think, is a good way of going about this. So these were the 2 examples I wanted to give you about emplotment, which leads us back to the idea of developing place and world building in particular. And I think world building is powerful for many different reasons, but one of them is that it often makes abstract ideas or concepts more understandable in terms that students can recognize from their own lives or that they can picture. An example of this, I think, is that for studying Weimar Germany, what students really need to understand early on is the huge division in society and in politics. And that is something that is very abstract. These are not things they would come across in their daily lives. And one way to alleviate this, I think, is world building, but in particular using material culture. So you remember we looked at building inside out and outside in, and starting with objects in people's lives is a good way of building from a small scale outwards. In this fantastic book, History Through Material Culture, the authors say that for historians, finding ways to access the values and meanings embodied within material things brings the past into clearer focus. And recently, Catherine Elston and Hannah Howard wrote a fantastic article about using material culture in history teaching, in Teaching History 176. So to give you an example of this, if I show my pupils these election posters of many different parties, what they will probably get from this is that there was political fragmentation. There were all of these little different groups, but they will probably struggle to see any kind of structure in this. However, if I ask them to look at the flags that are used in these election posters, what they will be able to see is that all of the parties at the top here, the Republican or centrist parties, use the kind of current German flag, the flag of the Republic, so black, red and gold. By contrast, in the bottom left corner, the communists don't use that same flag, they use their own flag, the red flag of revolution, and equally the nationalist right here on the bottom right of the screen, they continue to use the old flag of the German Empire. And this is something that historians of the period have called the Flaggenstreit, or the flag dispute. And really what this helps us to do is firstly to chunk these many different political fragmentations into three usable generalizations. We have the communist left, who use the red flag of revolution, we have the Republican center, and then we have the kind of nationalist right. And of course, for students, it is much easier to understand that flags are about identity, they express your identity, and that people use flags in order to form their identities and to share them with others. So what I try to do is that I teach the first part of the course, which is all about getting an understanding of these divisions, through the lens of this question: why could Germans not agree on a flag after losing World War I? And I think a student who can answer that question has understood a great deal about the Weimar Republic and about a key theme that will help them understand the rest of the course. And I think this is an example of how world building, in the sense of digging deep into this world, is a way of making abstract ideas more understandable and more relatable to our students. However, I don't want to stay at this level of society. I also want them to have an understanding of the kind of wider picture, and I want to build outwards. So I kind of sat down and thought about, if I look at a map of Germany at the time, what do I think will be helpful for them to know? So I identified these kind of three larger areas. So I want my students to understand that there were areas of heavy industry, such as the Ruhr or Thuringia, and they were characterized by large-scale factories, coal mining, and large cities. By contrast, in the kind of west and southwest of Germany, we have these large Catholic farming areas, which is a world of villages all structured around the Catholic Church. And in the kind of northeast, we have Prussia and other large Protestant rural areas, and in particular this area here of East Prussia, which is completely cut off from the rest of Germany. In my experience, pupils always find this very interesting, and it helps them to understand the impact of the Treaty of Versailles. They usually find it interesting that there's this whole area of Germany that is completely cut off from the rest. Now, these are all things that I find very interesting, but I don't teach them to my pupils just for that reason. I teach them to them because I think that this, again, builds foundational understandings that makes it easier to understand content later on, or to understand concepts. So for example, if we look at this diagram, which is one of my favorite diagrams ever, it shows us all of the elections to the Reichstag in the Weimar Republic, and it shows us the largest party, most successful party in each constituency. So if we look at the kind of big political shifts after 1929 here, and the rise of the Nazi vote, what pupils will hopefully be able to understand is that when the Nazis win 30–40% of the vote, that is not evenly spread across Germany. So there are some areas, such as East Prussia, for example, that are very supportive of the Nazi platform, whereas there are other areas that have very long-lasting political loyalties, and in particular, those are the kind of Catholic farming areas, which we just looked at. In the diagram, you can see those in purple. And understanding this later on makes it easier for pupils to understand the Nazis' approach towards the Catholic Church, and in particular, for example, the kind of social infrastructure of Catholicism, such as youth clubs. And equally, if they know that there are these kind of large areas of heavy industry where many of the unemployed start to vote for the communists, and the communists are the main rivals to the Nazis in the dying days of the Weimar Republic, that makes it easier for pupils to understand and remember that many of the early concentration camps were built in or around working class areas. So all of this makes it easier to understand these different separate ideas and bind them together. However, again, once we've built kind of inside out, we can then start building outside in again, because once we know these large areas, that helps us to zoom into them and kind of dip in and out of these areas. So when I come to study with pupils the kind of 1920s through this question, did the Golden Age heal Germany's wounds? What I think is that pupils who've understood something or know about the different areas, different social kind of environments within Germany, that you can't answer the question, did the Golden Age heal Germany's wounds, for all Germans. They will hopefully have a better understanding that someone who lived in Berlin will have had a different experience from someone who lived in the Bavarian Alps, such as in Oberstdorf. So really what world building does is that it underpins pupils' historical thinking, and it helps them to construct more sophisticated historical judgments. In this case, they will have a better understanding of the diversity of experience in the past. Equally, later, when we might want to look at change and continuity, we can return to a place such as Oberstdorf, which after 1933 becomes a training ground for Nazi soldiers, and really consider how much would life have changed for the people of Oberstdorf between 1918 until 1939. So again, world building supports historical thinking. So to sum up, these are kind of the things I wanted to talk about. So I wanted to give you two key examples for emplotment, and I wanted to give you 2 or 3 examples for world building. I'll be really, really interested to hear what you think about this, if you find it useful, and maybe even how you might apply these concepts in your own teaching of, in particular, GCSE topics. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to talking to you about this. Goodbye.